came to church. When you get to heaven, you be like, God, listen. I'm just saying. At times my faith wasn't as strong as some of the other people. But on that one Sunday in January 2024, it rained. And I still showed up. I love getting to be with you guys and worshiping with you guys. And I want to share today, really, it's about casting vision for the future, but it's as much sharing what God has done in the life of our church. One of the great patterns of the Christian faith, and really even going far beyond when the church started, is this idea of building altars. It's what the Israelites did to remember what God had done. And the truth is that altars can be, we saw this in Scripture, they can be something that becomes unhealthy, but when they are done in a fashion that is what they were designed for, which is to acknowledge something tangible as a reminder for something God has done. And it happens all throughout Scripture. They build altars to remember what God had done. Whether it was freeing them from Egypt and the slavery involved there, and the miracles that came against Pharaoh in order for them to be able to leave their position in Egypt. Or whether it was Joshua and the conquering trail he went on. At certain points in each one of these heroes and the people that would follow these heroes' journeys, they would build altars to remind them of what God was doing. Altars were designed because oftentimes we have spiritual amnesia, don't we? We forget. So often we live in the current moment that we're in, facing the current trial that's ahead of us with challenges that feel overwhelming, exhausting. Maybe that's where you are today, and I hope that today is as much about celebrating Anthem is really a blueprint for you to consider how maybe even you would look through both the rear view mirror of what God has done in your life and even process what God is doing currently in your life and build your faith for whatever it is that is in the future of your life. That's what today is really all about in the life of our church. Our altar that we're building today will be the stories that God has written in and through our church. There is literally thousands of them. I can only share a couple of my favorites. Before I do that, though, I want to read for you a couple Psalms that highlight the power of sharing the stories and sharing the specifics about what God is doing. Psalm 71 verse 5 says, "For you have been my hope, sovereign Lord, my confidence since my youth." The psalmist reflecting on his faith in the Lord, that when he unwinds his life mentally and thinks through all that he's been through as a child and a teenager and a young adult, now reflecting through many challenges, who he has become through those challenges, he not only reads the Scriptures, but also can see the Scriptures evident in his life, the power of reflection. That reflection has given him hope and confidence since his youth. Verse 6, "From birth I have relied on you. You brought me forth from my mother's womb. I will ever praise you." Even the simplicity of the miracle of his own birth was something worth reflecting on. You and I are not here by chance. That God has given us a time and a place in human history to experience both the beauty in the world that we're in, and unfortunately, as a result of the sin that came into the world, also the brokenness. And we live within that tension of the beauty and the brokenness, and as we reflect on living in that tension, if we look close enough, we can see God's hand all over each and every one of our stories, even in what seems to be the routine of new birth. I will ever praise you. Verse 7. "I have become a sign to many. You are my strong refuge." I love this because on one hand, the psalmist is writing that my life is a massive arrow to heaven and to the God of heaven and to the goodness of that God. My life has become a sign. And not only has my life become a sign, but you have become my refuge. In fact, the reason I can have such a massive arrow in my life pointing to your goodness is because when I am struggling and when I am going through hardship and when I am facing things that I think are far beyond my capabilities, you are the safe place for me in the quiet spaces where I have to set my mind right and my heart right, or I need to get right with the Lord. You are there, ever present, available to me. You are my strong refuge. Verse 8, my mouth is filled with your praise, declaring your splendor all day long. I love this concept of saying, listen, when I truly understand all that you have done for me, and not only walk through the specifics of that, but then even consider the weight of it. In your reflections, can you oftentimes feel the feelings that you felt as you reflect upon that story? And the weight as you sit in it a little bit. And you know just how much angst you had in that moment, or concern, or worries. You know the story and how it plays out now, but man, in the middle of the storm, you didn't know any of it. And so as you reflect on the faithfulness of God in the specific practical ways, you also consider how God brought his presence and oftentimes other people into that space to lift the burden. My mouth, as I consider and reflect on my life, is filled with your praise, declaring your splendor all day long. Today, we're just going to spend some time reflecting, and specifically reflecting not on Anthem's broad story, although that will be sprinkled in as we go through the stories, but really on the individuals in the life of the church. You've heard this said, if you've been around the church for any length of time, that a church isn't a building, and it's true. It really is true. A church is a people. A church is a movement of people that worship one God and share similar values and do life together. And in the beauty and the brokenness of this world, as they walk in the tension of that reality, they share in both the beauty that they experience and the brokenness that affects them, inside of them, around them. And they do it together. We call that the church. Does it have a physical address? Sure, you can Google Anthem Church. But what you won't find that's on the surface is our address and our location and our service times, but you have to go a little bit beyond that to truly experience Anthem Church. So if you're brand new, or if you're in your first couple of weeks, what an incredible Sunday to come, as you're going to get a little bit of who we are. Psalm 100 similarly reflects on all that God has done. Shout for joy to the Lord, all the earth. Worship the Lord with gladness. Come before him with joyful songs. Know that the Lord is good, is God. It is he who made us, and we are his. We are his people, the sheep of his pasture. Enter his gates with thanksgiving and his courts with praise. Give thanks to him and praise him, for the Lord is good, and his love endures forever. His faithfulness continues through all generations. You see, the reason is not, we reflect not only for the reason just to build our faith, we reflect because a good God is worthy of acknowledgement. A good God is worthy of praise. A good God is worthy of worship. And so we step back and as a church collectively say, hey, today as far as studying God's word, what we're going to do is basically write our own psalm today. I love worship. And I want to tell you too, part of the casting vision for the future is the guy that's been leading for worship for the last 3 years has been hired as our permanent Sunday worship leader, Kurt Adams. If you guys haven't got to meet him, it's an awesome, awesome thing to get to have a leader in that arena of our lives, for you guys to have consistency up here each and every week. He has a heart for worship. He's as good of a person as he is a worship leader, and I can't wait for you to meet him, his family, and see how he brings a spirit to our team that will really up the excellence value and really lead our church to the throne of God each and every week. So those types of things are happening, but they're happening because God is at work in the stories of our church. And we do it because he's worthy of our worship. As you came in today, did everybody get one of these? So this is just a simple pamphlet about all that God has done in 2023. If you didn't get one of these, this is how we did this. We printed one of these for every family in our church. And so you as a family, make sure you get one of these and take it home, and you can see it's got some stats, right? Part of worshiping the Lord is reflecting on what God has done statistically. And the reason churches often do this is because each stat represents a story. For example, 125 baptisms is an incredible number of baptisms in 6 years. And each one of those baptisms has an incredible story and a background. And you don't oftentimes know the story of the person getting in the tub, but our staff and volunteers and team get to experience that story. So today we just want to marinate a little bit in that so you can see all that God has been doing behind the scenes. This covers much of the stats. Today, though, is more about the stories. I want to share with you about a story that happened early on in the life of our church. In fact, so early that on that day in January, 6 years ago, we sent out flyers. And we sent them to the local neighborhoods, and you pick the area codes, and we're a brand new church. And so there's some area codes you got to click, and there's some you can't click. You know why? Because it's called a budget. That's why. And so you pick some, and then you don't pick some others. And I remember going through that process, and it feeling like, at first you're just thinking through just the practical reality of that process, like who's closest, and then all of a sudden strategy turns into prayer, and you go, well, God, who needs to get this? And as our team was reflecting on that, we eventually settled on some area codes, sent out this flyer, and one of the women that got this flyer, she's got an incredible story, and it's a story that's filled with some pain. But as she received this flyer, she was almost overwhelmed by the Lord. A flyer. You ever got overwhelmed as you looked at a flyer? I haven't. I find the trash can. But in this moment, something greater was happening. She looked at the flyer. She could see that a brand new church was starting at Rancho Buena Vista High School. Here's why she was overwhelmed. As she looked at that, she realized that 20 years prior to that, her and her ex-husband had planted a church at the same space, in the same room. And through a variety of choices on both parts, the marriage didn't work out, and of course, he leaves the ministry. And as a pastor's wife, it's a unique role in the life of the church because your career is tied to this success, but also your church family is tied to that. And so when your husband walks away from the ministry, you lose your church, your means of income, but you also lose your church community. And for her, she went through a process of really feeling like a failure. She felt like she was a waste of talent. Her and her husband just didn't do it right, and they were no longer needed by God. And she went through her own journey for about 20 years of just walking through the scriptures on what the scriptures say about her and what the scriptures declare about her, and walking through her own journey of forgiveness with the Lord, forgiveness for herself, and a variety of other things. She was in a small group, and she walked into her small group, and she had the flyer with her, and she slid it across the table, and she said, I'm going to have to go to this church. I don't know anybody at this church. I don't know anything about this church. I just feel overwhelmed by God that I've got to walk in to this building where we planted a church 20 years ago and allow God to write my redemption story. And so she did. And 6 years later, she found a church home, and God is rewriting her redemption story that started in the same building where so much brokenness happened. You can't write that story. You can't write that script. Shout for joy to the Lord, all the earth. We started a ministry called Safe Families. From the beginning, committed time and energy and platform space to this ministry, Safe Families, that is a really preventative foster care. And the idea is that a family in crisis will call our church, and there's not a lot of the red tape with foster care. Anybody that's ever gone through the foster system, it's insane how much work it is and how many classes you have to go to. And Safe Families is you can get involved with just a simple live scan. And you can open up your home to families in need, to kids in need in particular, and really bless families as they get on their feet and figure out whatever it is that's in front of them that led them to call. And this ministry has been unbelievable. There's some stats in here on this. I'll read the stats for you, but I really want to share the story. If you open up this book, you don't need it. I'll just share this real quick. Since launch, we have served 31 families, hosted 57 kids for a total, listen to this, of 1,350 safe nights. In 2023, we hosted 15 kids for 118 safe nights. One of those families was a strong single mother. She was strong, but she was, like many single parents, facing one difficulty after another. And she needed surgery. So somehow she got a hold of Safe Families, and her 2 daughters spent some significant time with one of the incredible families in our church. And they became very close. And at that time, we weren't sure if we were supposed to. We're really early on in the ministry, but there was some wisdom that said, hey, you focus on the kids, and we don't focus on the parents as much. Like, they're on their own journey. We don't want to complicate the relationships. And this family said, heck no, techno, we're gonna build a relationship with all of them. And so through kind of ministering to the mom and taking care of the kids, eventually that woman made her way to our church. Eventually, that woman not only made her way to our church, but gives her life to Jesus in the process of that. The kids, right, get involved in the youth group. And now, I tell you, that woman is a leader in a I'm not going to share it because I don't want to give away the story, but she's a key leader in one of the great ministries of our city. And she is doing incredible things, paying forward what God has done in her, all because we said yes early on to a ministry called Safe Families. It was really not just for the kids. It was what God was doing in the broader kingdom. I'll tell you another story. That same family that hosted those kids kept hosting. And one of the kids that they ended up hosting, they fell in love with. And typically, Safe Families is supposed to be a short-term scenario. 2 weeks. Even at 2 weeks, you kind of have to extend it beyond that. And you have to get approval, and then 3 weeks, and then it's like, well, this is meant to be temporary, and because there isn't a lot of red tape, the laws require that you keep it temporary. But the family fell in love with this kid, and the kid didn't have a home, a family, and the family that she did have and the home that she did have really was really not healthy. And that became apparent as the story began to unfold. So, Safe Family's temporary visit turned into an adoption process. That kid, because of a commitment to a ministry that's supposed to be temporary, that family has changed forever, that kid's life has changed forever, and now our church family gets to rally around them. Many of you guys know the story I'm telling, and have been a part of the journey of seeing, and it's 2 cultures too coming together in this family. And so you get a picture of heaven, not just in the redemption, but in the melding of cultures, and the melding of people, and the melding of 2 completely different backgrounds coming together, all because they said yes. Worship the Lord with gladness. Come before him with joyful songs. When we were at Green Oak Ranch, so when we went from Rancho Buena Vista to Green Oak Ranch, because of the pandemic in March, right, all of the public schools said not only are we not having school, but any extracurricular events are canceled. And we had this incredible setup in the theater, and you had to, if you guys remember back in the day, you had to walk down to the science lab where all the classrooms were, and it was a great setup. It was temporary. It was a lot of work. The setup and teardown was insane. We had 2 trailers. We had like a bunch of Brian Schulte designed like rolly carts that fit each room. It was an incredible journey. But when the pandemic came, it was like, hey, you can no longer meet here. Well, where are we going to go? And so we started just producing a service in a little studio. And then eventually we found that Green Oak was going to open up their field stuff, and it was perfect because at that time it was the height of the fear, and it was just starting to turn political. So it was just starting to get kind of very divisive in terms of what your opinions were on everything. How many of you guys are glad that's over? Oh my God. Everybody's mad about everything. You can't make a statement about anything. And you can't get toilet paper. Eventually made our way to Green Oak Ranch, and I remember we would set up cones. It was social distancing for families, and it was outside. And I remember talking to some of my pastor friends. They're like, everybody in our church is fighting. We're getting emails from conservatives. We're getting emails from liberals. Everybody's mad at us. And our church would show up outdoors. I'm like, nobody sends me emails. And it was such an incredible time. And the kids remember the kids playing in the background? You guys loved it. I couldn't focus. And in that season, one of the things that we decided to do as a church is we decided to get into the mentoring program at Green Oak. At that point, Green Oak had both men and women's programs, but the men's program was very large. And most of the guys, after they completed their blackout, which is they came in, submitted themselves, and proved over a long period of time that they were committed to the process of getting clean, they would enter into a mentoring relationship. And they didn't have enough mentors. So our church said, hey, we can supply some mentors. And at that time, I was like, I'm going to get in on this. And so I got to know several people in that journey and know them very well. I ended up mentoring 3 separate guys from Green Oak Ranch, all at different stages in their journey. And then I saw our men starting to mentor guys. Here's what ended up happening to the men in our church. This is what God does. If you've ever been on a mission trip, this is exactly what God does. When you are willing to step out in faith and really push yourself and experience things and people that maybe you wouldn't have otherwise, God does as much work in you as he does through you, doesn't he? And that's what happened. Our men begin to see that the guys they were mentoring had far more urgency and desperation than they did because they didn't need it. And so they were challenged. And as they were challenged, the men were challenged. And this beautiful relationship began to happen at Green Oak, not only between Anthem Church and the ministry of Green Oak, but also between the men of Anthem and the men at the ranch, mutually edifying each other in the journey of faith. Well, one of the guys that I got to mentor, I'll never forget the first meeting I had with him. It was so awkward. We walked into this library and we sat down, and you can't push them. The rules were you can't push them on faith. They have to really, really invite you into that conversation. And so if they just want to talk job applications, if they just want to talk building a resume, if they want to talk about anything, it's up to them to determine what you talk about. And so I'm sitting there trying to navigate this first-time relationship. I got all these rules that I had a pre-meeting on, and I'm just sitting there, and it's awkward, and he feels awkward, and I feel awkward, and we're just staring at each other. We're like, oh, this mentorship thing is weird, and I got my computer open, ready to write a resume if we got to write a resume, and it was so weird. We left, and I'm like, I'm not sure how this is going to go. I'm not sure if he's ever going to meet with me again. And so the next one, we have another meeting, and I get a text. It says, I'm not feeling so good. I'm like, oh, he's allergic to awkward. And so I let him have a pass on that one, but the next meeting we had, he tried to do it again. And this time he didn't say he wasn't feeling good. He said that he wasn't in a good space mentally. And it just so happens that day, I was having a cruddy day. So I wrote back, me either. Let's be miserable together. And I don't remember what happened at that meeting. I just remember, I think there was something about his background and his story that for somebody to pursue him, for somebody to not give up on him, was significant enough to show up that day. And we met, we continued to meet, and that meeting turned into a mentoring relationship, turned into eventually, when we opened this space, we needed somebody that was a hard worker, that was willing to learn and grow in the production department. So that mentoring relationship turned into a friendship, turned into a job opportunity. And that guy, he had never been clean for a significant period of time in his life. And he was quite literally learning how to be human off of drugs. So it wasn't without challenges. It wasn't without setbacks. It wasn't to be quite frank, if I would have treated him like a regular employee, it probably wouldn't have lasted long. But because I had the context of what it meant from what he went through and I heard so much of his story, we approached it quite a bit differently than we would have. And even to the point where there was some of you guys that were asking questions about what was happening in his life. And they were legitimate questions. But I knew his story. I knew God was writing a new one. And so that value says we're a place of grace. we decided to do something that's off the script and hang with him. And he hung with us. And I'll tell you, a couple years later, he's now married. He's got a kid. He's got a kid on the way. And he leads our production department. Know that the Lord is good. The Lord is God. It is he who made us, and we are his. We are his people, the sheep of his pasture. In February of last year, many of you were in this service. A family came in. We hadn't met them before, but they were going through something. And that was, very rarely do I get a story prior to a service, especially with somebody I've never met before, but that's how exactly this story played out, and it needed to play out. God was all over the details of how this one played out. Family came in. It was Sunday. Their son had been brutally shot and murdered 4 days prior. Broad daylight outside of an elementary school in San Marcos. And I didn't know the father at all, but as a father myself, you can only imagine that your heart quickly is overwhelmed. And even his physical posture and presence, and he's a strong man, he even got weak at times as he was telling me. His body literally almost gave out multiple times. He made his way into the service. And if you were in service that day, we went off script again. I got to tell you that when you're in a church that's following the Spirit of God, sometimes you have to go off script. And in that service, I've never heard the grieving process play out and so intensely, but it was happening right in the middle of worship, to the point where I had to address it from stage because I think there are people in the back that didn't know what was happening. And we came around that family, and we prayed for that family that day, and that began a journey of them being a part of us and us being a part of them, and walking them through the grieving process that they will be in for likely their entire lifetime because of a terrible tragedy. And we had ended up hosting the funeral, and I was moved by this young man's life, this young man's just leadership, and this young man's ability to just capture the crowd. And this room was filled with people that he had touched and with lives that he has influenced. And up on this stage, there was young person after young person after young person that came up and shared about the character of this young man. And then we got up, and a pastor, and it wasn't me, shared the gospel. And one of those young friends came forward and said, I want to give my life to the Lord. And that pastor ran and grabbed me, and I got to connect with that young man and eventually share kind of a follow-up conversation about what it is to follow Jesus and what it is to be loved by him, and why it's so important in this season of your life to lean into that, because in your pain, you can find yourselves in a far worse position unless you have the perspective to pursue the Lord despite your questions. Right? When you have questions in your life, you have two options. When you have the why question, when you have the worry, when you have the concern, when you have the hardship that asks where God is and what he's doing and why, over and over and over again, every single one of those moments in your life is an opportunity. You can either pursue the Lord and find out how good he is, or you can run away from him, not believing that he cares about you. And I found that those that run to him get an incredible story, and that those that run away from him experience great pain. Well, he decides in that moment he's going to run towards the Lord. That's going to be part of his story. And I meet with this young man now regularly each and every week as a one-on-one discipleship. And he doesn't have all his questions answered, but he has a community to do life with. He has somebody that will walk through the highs and lows, even some of the basic things in life. Friendship, community. That, my friends, is what the church is all about. To talk through, we're reading through the book of Mark right now. We just even this week, me and this young man that gave his life to Christ just last year are talking about maybe leading a group together and walking some young adults through what it means to follow Jesus, because he's been so fired up. Every time we get through the scriptures, he's got so many good questions about what the scriptures are about. And he's just learning the basics of the faith right now in real time. You see the difference between the why question that leads you away from the Lord into pain and the why questions that lead you towards Jesus and towards the people of God that will come around you and carry your burdens together. That's what the church is all about, and that's what God is doing in and through the life of our church. Both the father and that young men that gave their life to the Lord, you'll see a picture up on the screen, got baptized just a few months after they walked into Anthem Church. You see this? This is what it means when your doors are open for people who are hurting. This is what it means when not only are the doors open, but when they come in, the whole goal of this space is to be a place where they can experience and encounter a living God. The God we worship is not dead. He's alive. He's not asleep at the wheel. He's ever present in the good times and the bad times. And we just want to be a space where we continue to open the doors. Verse 5 says, "For the Lord is good, and his love endures forever. His faithfulness continues through all generations." Because of my kids' ages and my wife's role in the life of the church, I get to hear stories all the time. And so my daughter is in the middle school ministry, and so I got to pick her up on that late Wednesday, parents, you know what I'm talking about? Where you're in bed and you're so cozy in your pajamas, and you get the text that says she didn't get the ride home that you were hoping for, and you got to get up out of bed, and you got to go drive over, and then you walk into, and have you ever been here on a Wednesday night, and you walk into a space where kids can be themselves? It's wild, by the way. You don't like loud noises, then don't come. If you don't like chaos, then don't come, because we have strategically positioned this place for chaos on Wednesday nights. You know what happens? This is hilarious. If you guys didn't know this, on Wednesday night, there's 2 meetings. There's a prayer meeting, and there's a youth meeting. And the youth are quiet so the prayer meeting can happen. The prayer meeting happens with all the chaos outside of them, which is just a constant reminder to pray for the next generation of students and leaders in the church, right? And that's happening at the same time. And I think maybe 2 months ago, I walked into this and saw a 9th grade boy sharing beautifully articulating his faith to students. And then next, a 10th grade girl got up and shared her testimony. You may be shocking to hear this, but the 10th grade girl's testimony was longer than the 9th grade boy's. But 2 kids, you know, the generation that everybody's talking down on. You want to see the future leaders of the church? Come in on Wednesday night. They have their own band. I remember the first time they played together. I thought about coming in and being Simon Cowell just for a second. They've grown musically. The future leaders of the church are in this building. And they're focused on their faith. And they're focused on their future. And they're focused on loving the kids at their schools to be an impact and to make a difference. My wife helps to lead the women's Bible study here. And it's a space where you can hear, open up here, that if you guys have ever done the women's Bible study, there's like 60 to 70 women that come each and every week to the Bible study. And here's the beauty of it. And maybe you're one of them. Many of them come in and they don't have any faith background. They have they have far more questions than they do have answers. And they're not even sure what it means to be committed to Jesus. They're not even sure what it means to walk in Christ. And we've got women in groups from all different generations. And Lauren comes home and just shares the stories with me. And sometimes when I'm tired, I'm like, tell me that one tomorrow. But when I lean into those, I just think this is a space where women in our community can come and process the faith from all backgrounds. And many of you, your faith journey has been dramatically impacted by that. And then they go off to a retreat together and put on basically Disneyland for women. It's so fun to get to hear all the stories of what God's doing in the life of it. Those are just, I had to pick like 5 or 6. I'm going to end with this one. Today we sang a song called 10,000 Reasons. Aren't you glad that they don't go through each reason? That would be a long song. But one of the great challenges for me as a pastor was I got a call at 2 a.m. in March of, I think it was 2020. No, it was March of 2019. And I got a call and missed it. It was 2 a.m. from Michael Houghton. You guys know, many of you guys know Michael, and you know this story that I'm about to tell. But their 13-year-old had been killed in a DUI accident, heading up to see family. Here's the wildest part about it, is the day prior that their family led an entire outreach to serve the homeless in our city. It's just one of those stories that just doesn't make sense. Still to this day, I've seen God work in it and through it, but it still doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't satisfy the injustice of it all. But I remember being challenged as a leader that morning, trying to figure out, I'm going to drive to a church body that everybody knows this family. I'm going to have to deliver this news, and we're going to have a on-the-spot funeral. That's what's going to happen. And I called my mentor on the way, and he gave me some advice, and I remember just trying to wrap my head first around processing my own emotions, but then also trying to think about how to lead the church in this terrible situation. And as I pull up onto the campus, I can tell everybody's crying. I'm like, dang it. Cat's out of the bag, everybody's already starting to grieve and process. And I remember we got all the kids together. You guys remember this? We got all the kids together. We brought them in, and we had to break the news to the kids because he was 13, and they knew him. And I remember that day we had a guest worship leader who was really experienced and a great friend of mine. And I remember walking on stage, and they were rehearsing, and everybody else had at least had some time to process, albeit short, at least some time to process. And the band had no clue what was happening. And I remember walking on stage, and I remember walking right up to her. Her name was Marlena. And I said, hey, there's a group of people behind you that already know what I'm about to tell you. And they're in desperate need of worship. They're like, okay. And I had to muster up the words. Exactly what happened to Bryce. And I remember Marlena. She knew the Houghtons very well. She had one tear going down her cheek. And I remember taking a deep breath. And she said, God, help me. She turned around, and we sang that song, 10,000 Reasons. And the way that you worshiped that day, you guys worship great today. It was great. You sounded great. But it wasn't like that day. Because that day, we were worshiping on behalf of a family that was in desperate need of God. The comfort of God, the goodness of God. And there was nothing good about the situation. But we were also worshiping because we needed to believe that day. We needed to trust. We needed to have faith. We needed to lean into each other in that moment. I'm just telling you, I've never been prouder of our church than that day. What followed from there, Gail was recovering from, the mother was recovering from a really bad, part of the accident was her hip was shattered. And what we did is instead of a meal train, she wanted a presence train. Meaning like just put people next to me over and over and over again. Schedule people next to me. You want to know what church is? A church is when you put time slots together for somebody that's hurting just so somebody shows up. We ran out of people that knew her. She said, I don't care. Just bring somebody. Some of you guys are like, that would be my nightmare. Not for Gail. That's what she needed. And so we stand here together. You'd be like, why in the world would you share that story as proof of God's faithfulness? Because I believe that Bryce is in heaven, number one. Number two, because I've seen the church rally in ways that even blood relatives don't rally. I like to say this over the last 6 years, and I love my family, my blood family. I think the Spirit is thicker than blood. I do. I've seen it. experienced it, witnessed it. That's who this church is. That's who it's been for 6 years. And as we think through the vision of the future, the reality is, as we talk about the practical things that we need to do, so much of it is to continue to create a space where God can write these types of stories. We can band together in the good times and celebrate the things that God is doing, the spiritual breakthroughs. Or we can also be a community in deep pain, both experiencing the beauty of life and the brokenness of life and being together in that. That's what it means to be a church. So let me give you just a couple details. The band, you guys can go ahead and load. A couple details on where we're going. We are in this space. We've been in this space since January of 2022. So right around this time, 2 years ago, we opened up this building. And the lease expires. It's going to sound like, whoa, that was fast. The lease on this building expires December of 2026. So we are just under 3 years left on our lease. And as a result, there's a variety of things we're thinking through. Could we stay in this space? It's possible. Could we add on to our lease? According to the current structure of it, we could. It gets more expensive like any lease as the years go on, and we do not own it. We don't own this building. We built it out for this reason, knowing that this would be a space and a season where we wouldn't own a building, and as a result, we would be tenants of a space, with the goal that it would be able to build the congregation so that we could eventually afford a space to call our own home. That was the strategy from the beginning. So you ask, where are we currently at? What is the current plan? I would say this. Number one is we already are experiencing limitations. The room today is filled, but actually this is not where the limitation is. We could add a service and open up space for this. Our real limitation is in our extracurricular rooms. It's in the kids' rooms. Primarily, it's in the youth room. Right now, we have middle school and high school together. We'd love down the road for them to be able to have their own ministries. How many would you agree that a 12th grade boy and a 6th grade girl probably shouldn't be talking about the same types of things? Right? Let's put them in a small group together, see how that goes. Little girl's like, he said things weird. So high school students and middle school students, as it stands right now, meet together. Why? Because that's the current reality that we're in. Happens in life, right? You remember when you got your first apartment, first small house, and your family started to grow? Initially, you put them together, and then next thing you know, they're doing WWE moves off the bunk beds. You realize they need their own room. Same thing's true in the church. As we're growing, where we're going to run out of space first is in those extra rooms. We're already seeing it. And so eventually we would like to have a space that we can call home that allows not only that we own it, but the extra rooms fit our needs. And not only that, but we can expand as we need to. And the parking is not an issue in here. The worship center is not the first place we run out of room. Those rooms are where we primarily run out of rooms. But I'll tell you what, I'm as committed to creating space for kids of all ages so that we can have a place where they can be themselves and grow in their faith and ultimately become the future leaders, not only of the church, but of our city and communities. And so we need that. There's going to come a time where not only do we need a permanent home, but we also need enough space. We're going to get creative in the next 3 years in order to make that happen. It could be expanding out to a nearby, like one of these suites next door. We don't have really any room to go back. Initially, the goal was to open up the back, but that's now taken up by a different tenant. We had an opportunity, we didn't quite have an opportunity. We were in the talks to buy this entire building. And in the merge conversation, which is how we would make the down payment with Valley Bible Church, the check and the merge happened 1 week after the sale of this building, which is just one of those moments where you realize that God didn't want us to own this building. And we trust him with that. And so there's a lot of things happening, but the truth is we have 3 years left in this space. We know about how big we can get in this space. We know how we can grow. Now, I'm just going to tell you this. You may love the size of our church. I love the size that we're in right now. It's got momentum. It's exciting. We get to worship together, and yet there's also still a community. But let me just tell you, we will never be comfortable because as long as there's lost people out there, those doors will be open. That's this. So you ask, what's the vision for the size of this church? I don't have a vision for the size of this church. I just know we're going to keep putting a tub in here, and we're going to keep inviting people to faith, and we're going to keep inviting them into the baptismal pool, and we're going to keep raising up leaders. We're going to keep sending out church planters, and whatever size we are, in order for us to be able to successfully do that, is the vision. That's the vision. That's the goal. There's no number, and each church has a different size, and that size definitely does kind of shape who that church is. And I want us to always stay in intimate community, but we will always have the doors open. We're always as much focused about the empty seats as we are the ones that are filled. That's just what we believe about the mission and the Great Commission. That's who we are. And so as we grow, we need to make space for that growth. As people stumble in, either broken from their story or excited about what God's doing or curious about the faith, we need to be a place of grace where they come and encounter a living God and make decisions of faith in this place. And so today, as of this morning, we opened up a fund. It's just called HOME, HOME. This isn't a campaign. I don't have like fancy details. I don't have like the building could look like this. To be quite frank, this is the second fund we've ever had. And we are opening up that fund with $1 million in that fund. So as a result, because of the merge that we had with Valley Bible Church, they brought over money, and we, as a result, will have $1 million dedicated to their future space. That now is open to you. Here's what I'm going to say about that fund, and then we'll close. We're going to regularly highlight that in here, and if you're drawn to that above in your tithes and offerings, right, we need still the money to operate in this space. So just be clear, there's two funds. And oftentimes in the life of church, be as real as I can with you. Sometimes those funds compete with each other, and as a result, the operations drops. And then we're preparing for the future, but we don't have enough for today. And so as we navigate that, just be prayerful with your family on how you give to those things and whether or not you feel called and led to continue to invest in the future of Anthems. So there's two funds. There's the general operation fund. We got a couple church plant funds in there, and we are opening, as of today, the home fund and launching that with $1 million in it, which is another story of God's faithfulness. 6 years. If you would have told me 6 years, you're going to open up a fund and you're going to start with $1 million in it, you know what I would have said? Where do I sign? That's what I would have said. So that's what's happening. As of today, when you give, you will see a drop down that just simply says HOME. We are beginning to pray and plan for a future space that we own and that ultimately has the space necessary for all that God has called us to. Is that cool? Let's pray. God, thanks.